You are listening to Abnormal Spaces.
I'm Donnie.
I'm Ryan.
In this podcast, we discuss conceptual realities, the researchers, authors, and explorers who describe and define them, as well as our personal experiences in these abnormal spaces. In this episode, we discuss the so-called lost city or continent of Atlantis, the many authors, philosophers, and mystics who reported its existence, and contemplate the many lessons the Atlantians could provide us. So we had a few different podcasts where we talked about Dolores Cannon and we talked about Edgar Cayce. And something that's really interesting about the two of them is they both referenced Atlantis and Atlantean culture and some very specific things about Atlantis. And, you know, Edgar Cayce had done 14,000 or so readings, and over 500 of them were just about Atlantis or things about Atlantis and Atlantean culture. And so I wanted to look into it a little bit more. Like I remembered some things about Atlantis, you know, having learned them before. And so I wanted to kind of go back and revisit that. So I guess I had forgotten that Plato had written to Socrates about Atlantis. And he had said, you know, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't speak Greek. He said, this will sound untrue, but every word of it is true. And there are a lot of people that believe that Plato had gotten that information from Solon. And Solon was an Athenian philosopher, and some credit the idea of democracy as starting with Solon. Solon claims to have received this information from a priest and we use the word priest because that's the rough translation, but, you know, some kind of shaman, some kind of guide or something from Egypt. And the Egyptian person had told Solon about Atlantis, Atlantean culture, some of their lost technology, the myths about their lost technology, etc. And then Solon then told Plato, then Plato wrote all about it. And so essentially, one of the things that's really, really fascinating to me is that the pyramids at Giza were built somewhere between 2500 and 2700 BC. And that culture had developed for several thousand years before those were built. And I don't know what technology they used. None of us do. There are lots of theories. We've talked about some of those theories before. But I just wonder if there wasn't some use of Atlantean technology to help create those pyramids. And then, you know, of course, we talk about why, et cetera. I find it really fascinating in that we often believe that the Greek philosophers were onto something, that they knew more about humanity and about how to have a civilization, and we look to them for that. And a lot of the modern world was kind of built on the architecture of philosophical thought of the Athenians. So if that's the case, are we not also borrowing maybe from the stories of Atlantean culture and Atlantean technology? Did it not work its way through to the Athenians and those Greek philosophers? Maybe so.
Man, there's so much about Atlantis that I don't know. I kind of go in and out with it as far as like being interested in it and being like, okay, well, Atlantis, well, cool,
Right.
like.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the thing that interests me the most is the people that talk about it under hypnosis. I mean,
Hmm.
like you said, would you say Plato?
Hmm.
He wrote about it extensively, and like other people did too. It's just like when you hear it from somebody that's unconscious and speaking, it's a different kind of.
Yeah.
It seems a little different to me. Like I don't
Yeah.
know.
So it was an Egyptian priest or something that Solon got the information from. That person got it from what's known as the Scrolls of Aziz, and the characters that were used, the written language, doesn't exist anywhere else. And so the current theory is that is Atlantean language
Oh,
that's in there.
nice.
So that's really interesting. I think too that I think it was an Edgar Casey reading where they were talking about what happened to cause it to fall and disappear. And a lot of people look at some of the writings of Plato as a cautionary tale, but there are always cautionary tales. There are always societies that, got too progressive and too weird, and then they were destroyed. And so I think it's a little short-sighted to say that's why that happened. And in fact, in one of the Edgar Casey readings, it was revealed that there was a scourge, an animal menace, and they believe the animal menace to be megafauna, saber-toothed tigers, woolly mammoths, things of that nature, big ones. And I would imagine probably some big humanoids. A lot of the Nordic and Scandinavian culture have lots of myths and legends about, large humanoids.
The Cyclops,
yeah.
the giant,
All
yeah.
that stuff. Yeah. Trolls. And we think of trolls as smaller, but they were like mega humans. But anyway, so in this one particular Edgar Casey reading, they were trying to get rid of the animal menace. And in so doing, they ended up destroying their city, which was, and this is another really interesting thing to me. So some accounts are that it was its own continent. And then some accounts are there were 5 islands, and some accounts are there were 3 islands. And Plato's account, it's like a city with concentric rings, but it was a perfectly circular city. So anyway, we know that they used crystals from all the different readings and different history that we have on Atlantis that different scholars have pieced together. So we know they used a lot of psychic energy, a lot of crystals, and one of the theories is that in trying to get rid of the megafauna, they destroyed their city because they overdid something. They either over-energized something or the timing was wrong, because that's another thing. There was a talk of a pole shift, and they did the crystals the wrong way at the wrong time, right when the pole shift happened. There are some accounts that say that it was destroyed in one day and one night. I keep thinking, well, maybe it wasn't really an island. Maybe it was a spaceship. And maybe that's why it was a perfect circle. That's why you can't find it now. And maybe it didn't disappear. Maybe they opened some kind of wormhole.
Oh, yeah.
And flew away. Or
Never thought about that.
Or maybe they accidentally opened some kind of wormhole and shot themselves and the megafauna all into it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So there's, we don't know. One other really cool thing, I've been talking a lot here, but one other really cool thing, back to the 5 island theory. I believe it was one of Edgar Casey's readings, or it could have been one of Frederick Spencer Oliver's accounts, because he had the dweller on 2 planets. So I can't remember which one it was, but they said that, there are 5 types of man: black, white, red, yellow, brown. And I wondered if maybe those 5 islands referred to those different groups.
Oh, yeah.
But we don't know any of that. A lot of this we're hearing from, ancient peoples who didn't have the same types of knowledge that we have today, and different types of knowledge they had then. So, we today probably don't look at like, oh, there's 5 distinct, colors of man and types of man, the way they did. But, in their time, that was kind of commonly regarded as truth. And so, I can see where they came up with that, and I can see how that might be. Again, all we have are these readings, and Frederick Spencer Oliver and Edgar Cayce were both channelers. They both were receivers. And there's no way that either of them knew any Sanskrit. There's no way. But they refer to the Akashic record, and that word is from Sanskrit, and it means ether.
Yeah.
And so how would they have known that? It wasn't possible. I don't think there was a secret book that they both read that no one knew about,
No.
And we're a number of years apart. I mean, Frederick Spencer Oliver, he wrote this stuff when he was 17 in the 1880s, and Edgar Cayce was doing his readings in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So, I mean, they were different time periods. Frederick Spencer Oliver was out in California. Edgar Cayce, Hopkinsville, Kentucky. There's no way they would have shared information.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that kind of stuff is what fascinates me about early, channeler, because the ability to contact other people across, I mean, even like a state, I mean, it would take a considerable effort to do, especially like in the 1800s or so,
Right. Yeah.
Basically Edgar Cayce and the Dolores Cannon stuff on Atlantis, I mean, that's about the meat of it, and if you listen or read, which, who doesn't want to listen, I mean, we need to listen to stuff more. I listen to so many audiobooks. It also kind of gets into your subconscious a little bit too, because you end up recalling things and saying things that you don't even know,
Yeah.
So I think that helps in retaining knowledge about different things, because there is so much stuff in those books. I mean, it just, it jumps around from Atlantis to, other planets to whatever. But then Edgar Cayce, like, he just does a solid Atlantis,
Yeah.
He's just like, boom, here.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then, he'd wake up and disagree with what he said.
Exactly. That's even better.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, even in the QHHT, I mean, they do the same kind of thing. Their backgrounds are they're like, I want to be hypnotized, but I don't really believe this shit. Like, and a lot of people do believe it, and they are hypnotized, so. My brain is just like, I'm like, what am I? Oh yeah, that eclipse fried my brain. Yeah. So anyways, what I wish about all of this hypnosis stuff, and I've said it before, is that they hook these people up to EEG machines, because that is what is in the Monroe stuff, what makes it so concrete.
Yeah.
Because when you see that, any scientist could look at it and say, yeah, that person's asleep.
Right. Yes.
They're not awake. People under hypnosis are doing the same thing. They just don't hook them up to the machines. I just wish that would become a practice.
Yeah.
Yeah,
me too. And then, someone independent would review it and say, yes, definitively, this is happening.
Yeah, this person's operating in delta and theta.
Yeah.
They're not awake, yet they're speaking.
Yeah.
Like the Rosalind McKnight thing I sent you. That was I mean, she was measured the whole time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she was one of the explorer.
Yeah.
She was one of the explorers that there's extensive documentation about.
She was one of the first ones, I think.
Is that it? Yeah.
I think maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a whole thing about how they got started and all that. And she wasn't into that kind of thing either. And I don't think her husband really agreed with it so much. Maybe, kind of back in the day.
Yeah.
I listened to a few things just about Plato and all the extensive writing on Atlantis, and then like all of the fantastical or is fantastical a word?
It is.
Fantastical writings of Atlantis from the Greek philosophers and all that stuff. It gets into like Atlas and like, Poseidon and all of his sons. And then, in some of those stories, like Zeus, it punishes them like in Clash of the Titans. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it sends the Titan out,
Well, and that's another thing too. They referred to them as half God, half human because they didn't know what they were. And then in some of the accounts of the things that they were doing wrong, they experimented with making chimeras and bestiality, and they're like, oh yeah, that's absolutely why they got destroyed.
Yeah.
And then you think about the location of it, and so I always wrote off Bermuda Triangle as just kind of a representative bias, like we are assuming there's a correlation because these disappearances happen, but these disappearances happen all over. And just because it seems like there's a higher concentration in this one area is really just a failure of understanding and taking into account these other factors. Okay, that could all be. However, if the Atlanteans were there and they either opened some kind of wormhole or did some, super destructive force or whatever, it could very well be that there is still the remnants of that there. So, and the reason I say this is, you think about the meltdown at Chernobyl. There's one thing in particular, I can't remember if it's called like the elephant's foot or elephant's toes or something like that, but there's this one spot in particular where if you have 300 seconds of exposure to it, then you'll be dead in 2 days, period, no matter what.
Wow.
And they think that it's going to be like that for the next 100,000 years.
Jeez.
Right. So we look back at, and that's the other thing too, if you get into some of the different readings, it could be anywhere as old as 500,000 years ago to 9,000 years ago. There's this big discrepancy or just this wide range of how long ago Atlantis could have been here. And so I'm like, well, yeah, man, if they really blew the doors off of something, then maybe there is a spot there and we don't understand it because that knowledge was lost and maybe hidden so that we don't do it again. And because of that, since most humans can't really understand everything happening at once and living on different planes and interdimensionality and all of that, since they can't understand that anyway, then that's going to look like a bunch of just correlations in the Atlantic Ocean. And I'm like, maybe, but maybe not. Maybe there is something akin to a nuclear meltdown caused by something different that then causes different reactions or whatever. That could easily be. I mean, we don't know. We're not going to know.
Yeah. In those hypnosis sessions about Atlantis, because they were so efficient at using their mind, apparently, I mean, in these stories, like, I'm not going to keep saying that. So like, these are all stories and I give them more weight because of the hypnosis aspect of it. Because when you're in a sleep theta state or a delta state, I mean, you don't know anything really. Yeah. I mean, maybe there's some people out there that can know a dual sort of state. And I know that's a thing with astral projection and stuff, is like you can kind of have a dual state of like a little bit here, a little bit there.
Yeah.
That might be what's going on. But yeah, so in these stories, the technologies they were working with, they used crystals and they used their mind. they were telepathic. They could influence these crystals in ways that we can't even think about now. Different cultures would actually try to get certain crystals from the Atlanteans, and that's where some of the wars and things happened. But they couldn't ever use them because they didn't possess the knowledge of what to do with their mind with these crystals. And so it was almost like a built-in protection, you know?
Yeah.
Which I think is pretty sweet.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the wars, so there was an Atlantean general, for lack of a better term, that had some problem with the region that is now known as India. And I don't know if it was a resource squabble or what the situation was, but they went to attack, and the Vedic priests were able to repel their energy. And there are Vedic texts about Atlantis too. So that's another thing that I'm like, okay, there's no way Edgar Cayce knew anything about Vedic texts.
Yeah.
And same with Frederick Oliver too. It wouldn't make sense for him at 17 in the 1880s to know anything about Vedic texts.
Right.
But there was some kind of dispute between those two nations, and they tried that. The Vedic gurus were able to protect themselves, and they actually just turned the energy back on the Atlanteans and actually injured or killed some of the soldiers or whatever. And then so later, whenever there was the rise of the megafauna, they had to get all of the nations that were existing at the time together to figure out as a globe how they were going to take care of this animal menace.
Mm.
And I sometimes wonder if that's where it went haywire, because then they had to probably rapidly train these people from these other lands, and they just weren't equipped psychically to do it. Because again, the Atlanteans were probably some kind of alien or something
Just
different.
like a hybrid or just like some kind of thing like that.
So I think too about how time is nonlinear, everything is happening at the same time. So these things that happen, there are so many myths and cautionary tales about progressive societies dooming themselves. And I'm like, well, but is it all just the same thing happening at the same time? It's the same story. And the reason that it feels true is because it did happen in X amount of dimensions and is happening now. And, that's why those things, quote unquote, repeat themselves. It's not a repetition. It's another iteration of the
It's a timeline. It's like a parallel timeline or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like we haven't figured out how to phase in and out and to travel, to these different dimensions and whatnot. But certainly people have figured that out.
Oh yeah, astral projection. I mean, like
Right.
that's what that is.
Right. So there's probably a way then, and I don't know if it's focus level, 1,000,000 or what focus level it is, but I mean, it's attainable somehow.
Oh yeah, it's just practice.
Well, and first getting some guidance and then the practicing, but yeah, I mean, I think the answers can be found. I don't think they'll be believed because they're so fantastical, but I mean, there's got to be some truth to it.
Yeah, and I mean, at this point, it's just mainly for entertainment because everything is that way. Why do you do anything?
Right.
Like why do you watch a movie or read books or so this would be more like yeah, it would be cool to learn how to use a quartz crystal in a way that we have no idea how to use it.
Yeah.
Or whatever kind of crystal. I'm sure there's crystals that we have no idea about.
Right.
That they used.
Right.
When I think about their use of the mind and honing in, it's a skill like everything else. It's like exercise. If you exercise your mind and your subtle energy sensing apparatus, I don't know, like whatever it is that makes you, I'm going to say that you are the energy. So it's almost like you're just noticing what you really are.
Yeah. Yeah.
More than being like, oh, here's my hand,
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, I've heard that, it's just a skill. It takes a lot of work, like everything, like learning an instrument or doing anything.
Right. Yeah. Well, and, I keep coming back to, there are some people that are, for whatever reason, are just natural receivers.
Yeah.
And, Da Vinci probably, and Einstein maybe, Tesla definitely.
Yeah, totally. Or it's like Mozart.
Right. Yeah.
He was a little ass kid and he's writing all this insane shit.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, so it's the same thing. It's just people have talents.
Yeah. Well, but Tesla, he also championed crystals.
Yeah.
And why would he have had that knowledge? And, where did that come from?
Well, Tesla talked about his dreams and his visions and
exactly.
And just like lots of great inventors, even Edison, I think it was Edison who sat in a chair and he held two metal ball bearings in his hand and had a metal bowl underneath, and he would get on the edge of sleep. That would keep him in this little razor's edge of theta, basically.
Yeah.
And then when he fell asleep, his hand would open and the balls would drop out and he'd wake up.
Oh, yeah.
So that was his way of like staying on that little balanced edge.
Yeah.
It makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Oppenheimer apparently was asked about whether or not there had ever been another atomic detonation before. And he said yes. And people took it to mean, oh, you tested this before.
Right.
But I just wonder.
Atlanta, Georgia.
Right. Hotlanta.
Atlantis.
Well, and then, okay, so another thing too is you look at some of the megalithic structures, and I'm going to pronounce it wrong because I always pronounce it wrong, but Göbekli Tepe in Istanbul, modern, Turkey. That was about 11,000 years ago.
Mm.
So that predates the pyramids of Giza. Why did they build that? How did they build that? And that actually overlaps with the Atlantean timeline because Atlantis was supposed to have disappeared about 9,000 years ago. So they were probably either in contact with the Atlanteans or maybe there were Atlantean defectors, or maybe they were trying to have a rival city-state, or, something we don't know. But what we do know is they were able to achieve this. And often modern-day man looks at even 100, 200 years ago as very primitive people and primitive thinking, et cetera. And I'm like, well, okay, but go back over 11,000 years ago. What do you see? You see cities, you see usage of the natural world. So, I mean, why wouldn't Atlantis have existed? I don't see a reason other than we can't find it.
So, yeah, this kind of ties in with a lot of writings from Robert Monroe. In a couple of his out-of-body travels, he talks about meeting cultures of people from millions of years ago that collectively decided to leave. They raised their vibrational rate and they just winked out. He called it winked out. And in one of the writings, he was in a village and he was talking about the people, and it sounded kind of like a primitive sort of person, but he said that a little girl came up to him and they were talking, but they were talking without mouths. So they were talking telepathically.
Yeah.
And the little girl picked up a handful of dirt and closed her hand and opened it up, and it was like vegetables, or it was like food.
Yeah.
And so he was talking to them about like, so all you have to do is pick up dirt, and they're like, we can make this into whatever we need.
Yeah.
And he said at that point, shortly after that is when they kind of left, because they had mastered the use of energy to the extent that you would even need to on this planet. I mean, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
And if you look at like other writings from like swamis and all this stuff who have mastered the use of energy where they don't even have to eat.
Right. Yeah.
They call it like some kind of nectar or something that's produced in their mouth, and it nourishes their body just with their own body.
Yeah.
That's some like real shit. They're like people that haven't eaten in 80 years.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
And I just, that stuff blows my mind.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's all around us and it's available. It's just unlocking the secret. I think it's funny, too, that some of the people that wrote about Atlantis were obviously confined with the trappings of their time. And what I mean by that is, I think it was Frederick Oliver talked about flying machines that they used, and they were elephant hides, and they were filled with some kind of gas.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, right, because that in that time, in the late 1800s, people were working on dirigibles and blimps, and that was, I mean, the Empire State Building, that big antenna at the top was planned as a station for blimps to pick up and deliver passengers and cargo and stuff.
Crazy.
Yeah, that's what everyone thought the future was going to be as far as air travel goes. So it kind of makes sense that when he envisioned it, he could only explain it that way because that's all that he knew.
Yeah.
Sometimes people are like, well, that shows you that he really didn't see that he's making it up because that's the only knowledge he had. And I'm like, well, it's kind of like the non-dualism in that we're limited by the language that not only we possess, but that the people that we are speaking to possess, because we have to speak in the same language and we have to use terms that are mutually agreed upon so that there can be some kind of collective understanding between the two parties. So if that's the case, then he wouldn't have known what anything else was. Elephant skin, human skin, centaur skin, we don't know, but that's how he described it.
Yeah.
And so I feel like some of the occult stuff gets a bad rap, as it should, because there are lots of con artists at that time. I mean, for me, the jury's still out on Blavatsky. She seems kind of con artisty to me. And she was actually who published some weird, like, quasi-religion thing, and it was her company that published his writings after he died. And there are things about her that I'm like, yeah, I see why, people don't believe what she said. And then they're just like, well, all of it's wrong because she also said this. And I'm like, I don't know about that either. I have a hard time believing that all of these people were wrong. But I still think that causes people to more easily dismiss stuff. They're like, if they had psychic ability and crystals and knew how to harness energy and whatnot, why would they be using gas-filled elephant skin to fly around?
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's the same thing with Edgar Casey. I mean, if you listen to, or you even read a book of his, like, I can't even read it. It's like 1800s speak with old Bible speak.
Yeah.
And it's like, and to he, like to thou of him who does the like, it's stuff like that. And you're just like, I don't, what? It's like reading the Old Testament,
Yeah.
There are people like scholars who just try to decode that.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. But yeah, he was really was evangelical.
Yeah.
And we talked about that last episode. So in his consciousness or in his mind or whatever, like that's the filter that the information came through, because that was him. That was his identity.
Yeah. And I think people are like, well, why would they speak this way if they were channeling something else? And I'm like, well, I don't know. I think that there's a point where the information comes in, but the way it comes out has to be through the filter of that person's experience.
Yeah, totally.
And the language that they have,
Yeah.
I find that really neat, though, because I like to think about, like, what kinds of technologies they had and what it must have looked like. It's similar to, like we had said earlier, about how there are depictions of what appeared to us to be UFOs. And, like there was one description, I think it was in the Old Testament, about a chariot of fire in the sky.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I mean, that could be a comet. That could be a UFO. There's a lot of things that could be. We don't know what it was exactly. And they clearly didn't know. Or, when you hear chariot, you definitely think a vehicle. So maybe they did know, but that's how they described it because they didn't understand jet propulsion or whatever it was that was, doing it. I think that happens a lot too, where people are eager to dismiss based on that.
Yeah.
And I think that's wrong.
Yeah, I would do too, especially some of those pictures. It's just so obviously a UFO or like something, that we would, like a flying saucer.
Right, yeah. It really looks like that.
Yeah, or something with a helmet on.
Yeah.
Like, did I send you that?
No, but I've seen it before.
Yeah, old, how old was it?
Oh, it was very old. 4,000, 5,000 years old.
And it was a carving of something with a helmet that looked like a space person.
All the gods come from the sky, except the bad ones come from the ground.
Right. I know. So it's just, they were dealing with that.
Yeah.
They had a lot of limitations. We wouldn't even be able to go back there and talk to anybody.
Right.
They'd be like, you are what?
Exactly, yeah. Well, that's the other thing, too. I sometimes think about time travelers, and I wonder if it wasn't even an alien, but it's just a human time traveling.
Yeah, and even when, listening to QHHT sessions, like a lot of them talk about that even the extraterrestrials are us.
Yeah.
From the quote future, even though everything is now.
Right. Yeah.
That's how we have to think of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the whole interdimensional thing, I mean, that helps with the time-space problem because, if they're just phasing from one dimension to another, it can still be happening at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, just imagine sitting in the chair that you're sitting in right now. And all you have to do is close your eyes and perform some kind of energetic movement or whatever it is, something that you've learned maybe. You have not moved. You don't feel like you went anywhere. You don't feel like anything happens. And then you open your eyes and you're somewhere completely different.
Yeah.
And it's now. And it's happening now.
Yeah.
Okay, so like this is interesting to me. When I think about death or when I think about dying or the end of life, say like you're on your deathbed, I think I'm weird. I do think about this sometimes. I think about the last moments, like just like before my last breath,
Yeah.
And I think about, I'm really going to miss everybody. And I'm really going to miss all of these memories and all of these things that I've done and all that stuff. But then I think about when I go to bed every night and I have a dream.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know anything about any of this.
Yeah.
And I don't think about anything that's not actively happening in that dream.
Right.
So that to me has changed a way that I think about consciousness and the shifting of it and the memories and things. When you have a dream that you are, I don't know, driving a boat down a river and you're with all these people in the boat that you don't know, you're not thinking about your family and your memories of this life, and you're not, there's no thought of it. Yet you're still you.
So sometimes I do.
Oh, you do?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I'm sure it goes all ways.
Yeah. No, my dreams are really weird, and yeah, sometimes I do. What's really interesting to me is my youngest daughter will sometimes dream in third person, and that's never happened to me. I've never dreamt in third person, but basically she's like watching herself do things.
Yeah, I've done that.
See that, and I've had out of body experiences, but I don't dream that way.
I've had lots of the different, the third person. The out of body experience is obviously a third person thing. The lucid dream is an interesting one because it's basically where you wake up like this.
Mm-hmm.
And you can recall your memories. So that to me reminds me of maybe like a lucid dream situation where you have the faculty of drawing upon your present.
That's probably what it is.
Yeah.
That's probably it exactly.
Because that's when you're like, oh, I'm dreaming. And you're like, I wonder if I can fly. And you're like,
yes, yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So that's a lucid dream. And that's an out-of-body experience as well.
Yeah.
It's all the same. It's an astral projection. Only it's in an astral realm.
Right.
It's a higher frequency. You've bypassed the low part where you float out of your body, and you're in a dream, which is like what they would say would be more like a mental or like a causal level or something where your mind is everything. You know?
Yeah.
So you've bypassed that just by falling asleep.
Big brain right here.
Yeah, yes, you, man. I wouldn't expect no less from you. You're like, well, yeah, I remember everything. I'm like, hey, what's for dinner? I'm like, what am I going to make today? I'm going to cook steak, and then I'm going to go fly over this mountain.
Right, yeah.
I thought it was so interesting that I'd never really thought about that before. It just kind of popped in as a 1 second wonder of, we die every single night. Yeah, I know that, but I'm not missing anybody. I'm not missing anything. I'm too encapsulated and engrossed in what's happening in this dream.
Yes, no, that is totally true, and yeah, none of that stuff really factors into also like how you're going to behave in the dream. Like you don't have like, oh, I shouldn't do this because this thing's going to happen.
Yeah.
That doesn't usually happen.
Yeah, you're like, I have to stick my foot in this really dark hole and I don't know like what's in there, but I have to do it.
But I have to do it, yeah.
You would never think that here and now.
Right, yeah.
It's just so wild, man, to me. And that coincides perfectly with what people say about when the physical body does die, then it's like you're waking up from a dream, just like that.
Yeah.
That's what I would like to be.